I'm Shel Erickson. I'm affiliated this year with the Agrarian Studies program and the East Asian Studies program. My office is just upstairs. I'm very happy to present the final panel of the day today. We have three sets of scholars who will be presenting today. First up will be Colleen Boggs, who is a professor of English and women's and gender studies at my undergraduate alma mater of Dartmouth College. So to get things started off, Colleen Boggs will be presenting.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank the organizers for what truly has been an extraordinary conference. I know that a lot of thought and work has gone into it, and it's been really a privilege to be one of the beneficiaries in terms of being here for all of these wonderful talks over the past, 2 days now. And I'm truly honored to be able to speak to you today in this final panel of the conference. The title for my talk is Some Pig, Porcine Exceptionalism and the Biopolitics of Charlotte's Web. Some pig. The pig I refer to, or rather the pig that Charlotte's Web refers to, that pig is of course none other than Wilbur. Since E.W. White published his novel in 1952, the fame of any and all other pigs has been eclipsed by this runt of his litter. A survey from 2000 listed Charlotte's Web as the best-selling children's book in U.S. history, and even recent porcine successes, such as the 1995 film Babe, will have a ways to go to dislodge Wilbur from his position as the one pig that all Americans know. Wilbur is also increasingly the only pig they encounter. While there's already a nostalgia to Zuckerman's farm in 1952, the major transformation in agricultural practices had not yet occurred at the time of the novel's publication. It was between 1974 and 1991 that pig farms vanished from the American landscape under the pressure of agribusiness consolidation. In the largest pig-keeping region of the U.S., the American South, more than 200,000 farmers were driven out of business. Hand in hand with that change also came the disappearance of agricultural shows and the use of pigs as fairground attractions that we see in Wilbur's exhibition at the fair. Several scholars have read the novel as complicit with this shift towards large-scale factory farming and have criticized the work's focus on one pig's salvation as sanctioning mass slaughter and violence. With the decreased visibility of farms and pigs in the American landscape, the ongoing success of Charlotte's Web is worth another look as we assess the cultural frameworks for our experience of pigs. Reading Charlotte's Web through the lens of so-called animal studies, I argue that the novel relates two crucial philosophical and affective approaches for engaging with pigs, namely those of biopower and intimacy. Charlotte's Web stages a drama of sovereignty that may seem nostalgic, but that is thoroughly utopic in envisioning cross-species intimacy as an alternative to death-oriented biopower. E.B. White described his novel as a paean to life, a hymn to the barn. As such, his novel is worth another look. Part 1, Biopower. In Chapter 9, The Miracle, and I should give you a visual at some point. In Chapter 9, The Miracle, the web that the spider Charlotte spins reveals words for the first time. Some pig. However, those words are an echo of the novel's first page. When Fern asks her mother why her father is carrying an axe, Mrs. Arable replies that some pigs were born last night and explains that the father plans to kill the runt. Whereas Mrs. Arable dismissively speaks of some pigs, in the plural, as dispensable life, Charlotte's writing transforms that dispensable life into exceptional life. Some pig is not the plural some pigs, but is singular and individuated in its reference to Wilbur. Several scholars have been critical of the novel on these grounds. They read this focus on an individual and exceptional pig as obscuring the plight of pigs in general who are fattened and slaughtered. I'm going to give a shout out here to Brett Mazel. So as Brett Mazel puts it, These stories of exceptional pigs, either kept as pets or somehow rescued from slaughter, ultimately serve as a palliative exception that helps us forget that our dominant relationship with pigs involves killing and eating them. In this context, it is worth noting that Fern returns from rescuing Wilbur to her breakfast in a room that smelled of bacon. Saved from slaughter stories stage the salvation of individual animals and thereby obscure the fact that millions of anonymous hogs and pigs are measured in the aggregate and by the herd. I find this a valid reading of Charlotte's Web, and yet the novel also offers another interpretation that makes it critical of, rather than complicit with, this dynamic. That other interpretation hinges on the fact that, and here again I'm actually quoting Brett Mazel, humans' power over nature in general, and pigs in particular, is made possible in part by our belief in the separation of nature and culture. Charlotte's Web opens with a critique of that separation by revealing the power dynamics that establish such a separation between nature and culture in the first place. It plays out that critique via cross-species intimacies that challenge even current animal studies scholars to move beyond anthropocentrism, that is, beyond privileging the human in discussions of species. Scholarly interest in biopolitics and biopower emerged in the early years of the new millennium when scholars concerned with the ethics of the so-called war on terror looked towards Michel Foucault's conceptualization for an analytical framework. While Foucault coined the term biopolitics and biopower and used them to describe the reach of power into life forms as such, he never fully developed the concepts in his work. In response to Foucault's work, two major schools of biopolitical theory have developed, mainly in Europe. Giorgio Agamben focuses on biopower as a negative force tied to death. By contrast, Michael Hart, Antonio Negri, and Roberto Esposito theorize an affirmative version of biopower that contains revolutionary potential for unsettling structures of sovereignty. Given the fact that Wilbur is an exceptional pig, by many scholars' accounts, Agamben's work on the state of exception and the biopolitical use of exceptionalism might at first glance seem the more useful to invoke here. So let's explore that line of inquiry. For Agamben, the power to differentiate between life forms is key to the exercise of sovereign power. Revitalizing categories introduced by Aristotle, Agamben argues that life is divided between bios, a political form of life, and zoe, a purely physiological form of life. Zoe is foundational to, but excluded from the political order. For Agamben, sovereignty is the exercise of determining which life form counts as bios. In making that determination, the sovereign removes himself from bios and occupies an exceptional position outside of the law, a position that is mirrored by the so-called homo sacer, that is, by a figure of abjection that, too, is removed from the law and subject to non-punishable and non-mournable death. Wherefore, Agamben, this process of distinguishing bios from zoe occurs at the level of sovereignty and law-giving. Charlotte's Web opens with a scene that reveals the mundane, lived dimensions of sovereignty that organize everyday species relationships. The novel begins with Fern Arable's father venturing forth to, quote-unquote, do away with a pig. That is, to kill it, as Fern spells out when she corrects her mother's euphemism. Fern does not merely interrupt her father's exercise of human sovereignty. She draws attention to and questions the very parameters by which human and animal life are distinguished from one another. She asks her father, "If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" By the laws of species sovereignty, Fern's question is absolutely misguided, as her father points out when he says, "Certainly not. But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another." The difference that Mr. Arable invokes is one of species, but also one of law. Not only would it be illegal to kill Fern, but the very notion of legality, of the law of species sovereignty, depends on the distinction between human and animal. However, it is that distinction and the grounds of law itself that Fern disputes when she replies, "I see no difference," and ties her remarks to the question of justice in complaining that this is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of. Mr. Arable's response is not what we might expect. Instead of insisting on the distinction between bios and zoe that he was about to perform, he relinquishes. In response to Fern's plea, a queer look came over John Arable's face, and the queerness of that look is tied to affect. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. The exchange between father and daughter pivots on notions of legality that are pitted against senses of compassion. Mr. Arable relinquishes, and it is not the only time that Fern finds an unexpected ally in her father, the nominal representative of human sovereignty and biopower on the farm. The second time Mr. Arable sides with Fern is less physically dramatic, but as significant. Charlotte's Web does not only reflect on the material power over animals, but also engages with human beings' symbolic control. Fern not only subverts the structures of sovereignty and the distinction of human from animal life, she also questions the communicative structures that grow from and enable the biopolitical frame. After Fern's account of the goings-on in the barn, Mrs. Arable turns to her husband and expresses her worry that Fern believes the animals can talk. In response, Mr. Arable chuckles and replies, "Maybe they do talk. I've sometimes wondered." Unexpectedly, he's Fern's ally not only in suspending the exercise of biopolitical sovereignty, but also in extending the symbolic frame to encompass animals as participatory beings in communicative structures. That conceit of animals participating in the structures of symbol and meaning-making is, of course, the central conceit of Charlotte's Web. On the surface, it seems to be the ability for animals to participate in semiotics that saves Wilbur. And yet, the novel ultimately does not sustain that interpretation. For one thing, Fern and Mr. Arable have been able to communicate with animals all along. So Charlotte's communicative act can come as a miracle only to those characters such as Mrs. Arable who have failed to recognize this communication. Second, Charlotte's Web creates a sleight of hand by which readers mistake signifiers for signifieds and identify the miraculous writing with the pig, Wilbur. At an earlier point in his career, E.B. White had worked in advertising. He'd been a Don Draper of the 1920s, so to speak. His early work at the New Yorker often satirized advertising, and that satire is visible here as well. Then third, language and writing themselves are ultimately insufficient conditions for Wilbur's removal from Zoe and participation in bios. Even after Charlotte's writing appears, she feels the urgency to keep writing. What then do these repeated acts of writing do that the initial miracle could not perform? What is at stake in the repetition? The answer to this question is that the repeated act of writing brings together and builds a community. Again and again, people travel to see and marvel at the writing in the web. Again and again, the animals scramble to find words for Charlotte to weave. The community that Charlotte's Web constructs crosses species difference in two ways. It is built on the community between human beings and animals that Wilbur and Fern first formed, but extends to a community among different animal species that Wilbur constructs in the barnyard. Charlotte's Web is not just about the drama of sovereignty. It is about replacing the drama of sovereignty with the affective care of community. Part 2, cross-animal species intimacy and affirmative biopolitics. To develop an analytical framework that ties this reading of the novel to its intervention into biopolitics, the Agamben approach doesn't offer us any answers, especially because, as Timothy Campbell has pointed out, it is both dehistoricizing and negative, even tragic in tonality. Antonio Negri, as well as Roberto Esposito, theorize a different form of biopolitics, one that accentuates the moment of resistance to power and has the potential to create a revolutionary horizon in the heart of empire. For Esposito, that alternative depends on exploding the compound that is biopolitics by creating a rupture between biology and politics, between bios and politicos. I want to read E.B. White as envisioning this possibility when he insisted, somewhat paradoxically, that there is no political meaning in the story. If the drama of biopolitics that the novel stages is one that has no political meaning, then that is not an abnegation of biopolitical significance, but an intervention into its frames and parameters. How then does White remove bios from politicos? That is, how does he achieve Wilbur's salvation from slaughter without replicating the structures of exceptionalism that would seem requisite under the Agamben frame of sovereignty? The kind of affirmative biopolitics Esposito imagines is deeply utopian in that it anticipates the coming of a virtual community. It is precisely that shift from the actual to the virtual community that Charlotte's Web stages. With Charlotte's death, the actual community that Wilbur and she had constructed disappears, but it is replaced by a virtual community, that is, an abeyance while Charlotte's eggs are waiting to hatch. Even when the little spiders appear, they represent the next generations as much as the past generations. They instate a principle of communal renewal that does not negate individuals, but also does not hinge or depend on them. It envisions something along the lines of what Esposito and Gilles Deleuze conceptualize as an impersonal singularity or singular impersonality. That is not to say that the individuals or the collective are dispensable, nor does the novel go as far as Deleuze in moving away from notions of the subject. The multitude of spiders remains, after all, in relation to the one and the only Wilbur. And yet in the novel's beginning, Wilbur does not talk and has no discernible perspective or personality. It is only when he moves from Fern's care to the barn that he becomes Wilbur. It is not individuality per se, then, that the novel emphasizes, but individuation as a communal process. When Wilbur reflects that he's tired of living, his death-oriented outlook changes by the goose addressing him as, my friend, my friend. And it's my best goose voice. As White put it, I think it would be quite untrue to suggest that barnyard creatures are dependent on each other. The barn is a community of rugged individualists, everybody mildly suspicious of everybody else, including me. Whether we buy into White's hermeneutics of suspicion or into the novel's framing of relationship as friendship, in Charlotte's Web, it is the principle of community itself that constructs meaning and subjectivity. That does not make meaning and subjectivity optional. By the book's logic, community is pervasive and expansive. Community includes but does not privilege human beings. Much work in animal studies concerns itself with the construction of relationships, and yet those relationships are almost exclusively between human beings and other animals. So if we think about a concept such as companion species, one of those companions always seems to be human. Charlotte's Web rarely considers, this work in animal studies rarely considers, let alone focuses, on the relationships between animals. While Charlotte's Web does not ignore the relationship between human beings and animals, and for that matter facilitates it throughout for its readers, it also imagines relationships among animal species as meaningful and constructive of community and intimacy. It is that construction of cross-animal species community that allows the novel to offer a new dimension to the field of so-called animal studies, whether by that we mean the current theorizations in the humanities that have developed in the wake of Jacques Derrida's last publications, or whether we mean the activist strand that focuses on the treatment of animals. In conclusion, Charlotte's Web is a novel that critiques structures of sovereignty and imagines an affirmative form of biopower that connects species. As a pig, that is, a domesticated animal that can also be or even become feral, Wilbur is poised to serve as relay between the world of humans and the world of animals in a larger barnyard ecology that imagines community as an intervention into biopower and the site of alternative subject formations. Children's literature itself emerged in the wake of John Locke's thoughts on education. Locke advocated two things. One, literary instruction with child-appropriate materials, for which he recommended Aesop's fables. And two, civic instruction in kindness to animals, which would teach children to regulate their despotic tendencies and make them good citizens. Locke's ideas gave rise to the development of children's literature in general and animal stories in particular, and Charlotte's Web is their inheritor as much as their exemplar. As the novel says in its conclusion, it is not often that someone comes along who's a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both. She remained so to generations of child readers. Yet perhaps the novel's most valuable challenge to us as contemporary readers lies in its imagining a horizon of possibility, a utopia by which current forms of biopower may be superseded by rethinking our relationship to animals and validating their relationships to one another. That work remains to be done. Thank you very much for listening.